Thank you very much for D-Wave for inviting us to this beautiful, beautiful venue to present our work. And today we are trying to answer a very, very critical question. Can quantum computing improve the efficiency of payment system? And more specifically for high-value payment processing system. And at the same time, I have to thank the organizers to slot us in right after the lunchtime. Hopefully everybody with the fabulous lunch will be able to stay awake, and hopefully our project is actually interesting enough to keep everybody awake. And that's one thing that I want to thank Steve Flinter from MasterCard on some of the work that they have done, fabulous job. And I had a great opportunity to talk to him after his second demo. And if you can recall, they were more focused on the similar type of problem, payment settlement optimization. Now, they are more focusing on the foreign exchange FX component of it. To our side, we are a little bit different. We are actually more focusing on the liquidity efficiency, particularly around the minimizing the liquidity utilization. But at the same time, it's a very, very similar problem, and I have to thank him because he has already provided very, very good business context, allow us to do a better, easier job to explain the problem domain that we're actually trying to solve. Before we do our presentation, do allow me to spend a little time on introducing myself. My name is Thomas, one of the co-founder at GoodLabs. My co-founder and I really around building GoodLabs for a very, very simple mantra. The whole purpose of GoodLabs is actually building a home for us to bring in amazing, top-notch software engineers, researchers, and domain experts come together, solve complex problems for our customers and for ourselves. And one of the things that we would like to do is really having a lot of fun solving big problems together. And today, I also brought in some of my team members to do the presentation for us. We have Jean-Paul Lam, JP, who is our special project advisor, specialized in machine learning in finance. We have Chris, our director of quantum and emerging technologies. And we also have Donald, our quantum algorithm researcher and developer. At GoodLabs, other than advanced software engineering service that we provide to our customer, we also actually spend quite a bit of time on what we call the intelligence engineering. Similar to a lot of other firms, we utilize a lot of classical approach, the like of machine learning, deep learning, neural network, natural language processing to solve some of the really, really big challenge for some of our customers in healthcare and finance. One thing that we are actually a little bit different is we also have quite a bit of interest in the quantum area. And typically what we would do is separate, doing a parallel exercise where one side, when we actually receive a problem, we will actually use the classical approach to provide the best solution as much as we can. But at the same time, if the problem domain is actually suitable, we're also trying to use the quantum approach to see whether we can actually even derive a better solution. And at the same time, because of the parallel exercise, what we are trying to achieve is whether one side can inspire the other to even amalgamating it together as a hybrid solution, where the sole objective is really around delivering a better solution for a much bigger, more complex problem. A bit of a background of our project. It is a pivot initiative from the Bank of Canada. They wanted to find out for the next 5 to 10 years whether quantum computing would be a viable solution to solve some of the really, really big issue for the central bank level, national financial backbone type of problem. And we're the only company got selected by the Bank of Canada to work on this project, obviously for the quantum experience that we have, But more importantly, because of our deep understanding on the high-value payment processing system. On the Canadian side, our high-value payment processing system roughly handle around 50,000 to 60,000 payment requests on a daily basis, summing up to be around $500 billion dollar volume for 17 financial institutions. And the whole objective of the project is really around driving down the liquidity utilization to be able to optimize the cost of liquidity for all the 17 financial institutions. As we all know nowadays, particularly at the current landscape when our interest rate is actually going up, really driving up really high and fast, to be able to save the liquidity cost for the financial institution is a very, very relevant problem. Now, there's a funny story behind the dollar volume on the Canadian side. Because of the work we do, we got invited to present our same project to a US payment organization with over 400 members. Mostly is financial institutions in US. And because the work that we do is actually related to quantum, so we attract quite a bit of interest. So after the presentation, a lot of people are actually coming up to us talking about the work that we do. And then I got a chance to talk to a gentleman who is the innovation executive of a US equivalent counterpart for the high-value payment processing on their side. And he was talking to me, he's like, oh, Thomas, like, so on the Canadian side, you're actually doing roughly $500 billion. As a proud Canadian, I was like looking at it as, yeah, you know, it's a big problem we're solving. And then I threw the same question back to him and said, so on your side, what type of data volume do you guys do? Very casual, very casual. He said, yeah, we're doing $2 trillion. Mic drop, amazing. I just love it, the American spirit. Hopefully one day that we can actually solve the $2 trillion problem. So what we're going to do today, first, right in, we will describe the exact problem that we are solving, full business context, why and what we are actually doing. And then what we will do is we will actually go right into the solution that we develop, and particularly focusing on how we utilize D-Wave CQM hybrid technology to be able to deliver a very, very tangible solution that we can actually run in a production live setting environment. And then we'll actually go on to present the results that we have and some of the challenges that we face, and then we'll actually talk about the next step of the project. Let's get right into the problem. And now I would like to invite my teammate, Jean-Paul Lam, JP. JP is our special project advisor at GoodLabs, specialized in machine learning in finance. He's also a professor at the University of Waterloo, so very, very lucky of you that you get a high-quality University of Waterloo type of lecture for free. Promise, I won't charge you, any one of you, for that. And at the same time, prior to that, he was the assistant chief of economist at the Bank of Canada. So he knows the high-value payment processing inside and out. JP, all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you won't ask for a refund after this. Let me start by telling you what we do. Thomas already touched on what we're doing in this project. We developed a novel approach to save Canadian financial institutions participating in the high-value payment system billions of dollars without significantly increasing the time it takes for settlement and payments to go through the system. So fairly simple. So what is a high-value payment system? Well, you can think of the high-value payment system as allowing financial institutions to send and receive payments on behalf of their clients, but it's not just any payments. Those payments are wholesale payments, so very large payments. And these payments are settled with finality. So there's little credit risk for participants in the system. So LYNX is the Canadian high-value payment system. Thomas already talked a little bit about the statistics surrounding LYNX. LYNX processes about 50,000 payments per day. That's on a quasi or real-time basis. That's not a lot of payments, actually, if you think about it, for an economy like Canada or the US or any G7 economy. What really stands out is the value of these transactions. So on a daily basis, LYNX would do about $500 billion of transaction. To put that in a bit more perspective, that's on a yearly basis, the transaction value, that's 4 times the size of US GDP, and that's about the size of the global economy's GDP. So that's not trivial. But more importantly, LYNX is of systemic importance for the Canadian financial system and the Canadian economy in general, and also a crucial tool through which the Bank of Canada, the central bank, implements monetary policy. Now, one of the characteristics of high-value payment system is that they are gross settlement system. What that means is that payments are settled either in real time or in quasi-real time with finality. So that eliminates those credit risks that market participants have to face. This is great. So payments go through very quickly with finality, but it has an opportunity cost, or there is a trade-off here. The trade-off is that because firms have to pay immediately, they face a high liquidity cost, and that can be substantial. Now, a lot of these payment systems are very similar across the world. If you take LYNX in Canada, FedWire in the US, Target2 in Europe, CHAPS in the UK, they all operate the same way. One of the things they tend to do is try to implement measures that can save participants liquidity costs. And one of these measures that they implement is the so-called liquidity savings mechanism. So at the core of it, liquidity savings mechanisms are very simple tools that try to reduce the liquidity cost of participants. So what they do is most of them collect payments in a queue or in a batch, and then try to find ways to offset outgoing payments with incoming ones, recycling liquidity and thereby decreasing the liquidity cost of these participants. Now, one of the things we also try to do at the same time is minimize settlement delays so that payments go through very quickly and they are not accumulated throughout the day. So one of the big disadvantages of, or the current shortcomings of existing LSM is that they are ad hoc, non-optimal, you can call it what you want, but what they don't do is they don't search on the entire solution space to find the solution that would minimize liquidity costs for participants. And this is where we come in. So our solution is fairly simple. We run this novel algorithm that searches on the entire solution space and try to rearrange payments within a queue so that we can minimize the liquidity cost of each participant. So now I'm going to invite Chris McMahon on stage to talk more about what we do and our solution and our algorithm. Chris is the director of quantum at GoodLabs. He has a PhD in condensed matter and materials physics from the University of Waterloo. Besides being super tall, Chris is really passionate about quantum and AI to bring those tools to make our lives better. Chris?
Thanks, JP. See if I can get this to work. There we go. So I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about some of the mathematical details of this problem we're trying to solve and how we could use D-Waves and Euler to solve it. So to start off, I think we should look at a really simple example. And I want you guys to be thinking about this in terms of a game that we want to win. So in this game, we're going to assume there's just 2 players. We've called them Johnny and Mary. And they need to settle some payments between each other. In this case, just 3 payments. Now, we also want to assume that these payments come in over some period of time. So that way they have a chronological order. And so if we execute these payments in that chronological order, we call that a first in, first out setup, or FIFO for short. So in our example, Johnny first has to pay Mary $10 billion. A little later on, he has to pay $5 billion. And then finally, Mary has to pay $14 billion back to Johnny. Now, what we're interested in is how much money does every player need to have in their account at the start of the game, so that way all these payments can settle and nobody goes into debt. We call that the liquidity requirement. So if I've done my math right, Johnny here needs $15 billion, but Mary doesn't need anything because she receives 15 before she then has to pay 14 back out. So she's lucky, she just gets to recycle liquidity. Now, where does the game come in? We can accumulate these payments in a queue, and we can wait until they all come in, and then we can decide to reorder them in any way that we want, such that we can reduce the total liquidity required in the system. So what you want to be paying attention to is the sum of those two numbers on the right. So in this very simple system, it's not too hard to find a better answer than FIFO. So for example, here, if we do the $5 billion payment first, then the 14, and then the 10, now Johnny only needs $5 billion in his account to settle all his payments, and Mary now needs $9 billion. So if we add those up, 9 plus 5 goes to 14, so we now saved $1 billion in liquidity compared to FIFO, and we've won the game. As an added bonus, the liquidity is also more evenly distributed between the two players, which is not our actual objective, but it is something that central banks care about. Okay, so when the situation gets a lot more complicated, and we have, say, 16, 17 players and many, many payments throughout the day, how can we get the annealer to solve it? Well, of course, we have to formulate this problem in terms of an Ising Hamiltonian. This is the one we've derived. I've shown it up on the screen. I'm not going to go through it in excruciating detail, but there's sort of three main parts to think about. On the top left, we have the sum of the liquidity in everyone's account. That would be the numbers that were on the right in the previous slide. And of course, that's just what we want to minimize. We then have to subject that to a few constraints. So the one on the top right, it basically just says that in everyone's account, they can't go negative at any point during the settlement. Instead, they have to raise their initial liquidity requirement. So this is the one that's doing the heavy lifting. And then on the bottom, we just have a couple of bookkeeping constraints that are just making sure that every payment gets settled once and only once. Okay, so now I want to show you something that more closely resembles the actual data that we've been dealing with. This is still a simplified example, so we still just have two participants represented by the blue curve and the pink curve, but now we have 70 payments. And what I've plotted here is a little bit different than what we've been talking about. I'm going to call it the net position, and it just represents the amount of money that's coming into or out of the accounts as we settle every payment. The important part here is that whenever the curve is below the x-axis, we say that that player is in a debit position, which means they're digging into that initial liquidity that they had stored up at the beginning of the game. And whenever they're above the x-axis, they're in a credit position, which means they're on easy street and they're just recycling liquidity that someone else has given them already. So what we want to do is examine the maximum net debit position for every player, which is just the maximum negative peak that player reaches at some point during the day. And if we add those up for all the players, that's the total liquidity that we need. In the first in, first out situation here on this slide, that amounts to $1.3 billion. Now, if we run this through the quantum optimizer, we get a result like the one on the bottom. And you can see that all those negative peaks have been very much reduced. And so the maximum amount of liquidity required comes out to something like 350 million, which is a very big reduction. Okay, so at this point, we can dive into the results of the actual experiment. For that, I'm going to pass things over to Donald. Donald has a background in physics and a PhD in quantum chemistry, so he understands quantum annealers very well. And he's sort of the data guru at GoodLabs, so he's a good guy to do it.
Thanks, Chris.
Good luck.
Thanks for introducing the problem and the setup. So when we started this project, we looked at different quantum options, but we quickly settled on the CQM because size and speed were important to us. Once we made this decision, we decided to test the limits of what the CQM could do. We increased the batch size mentioned earlier from for different batches up to the maximum variable size of 700 that the system could handle. What we show here is the change in aggregate max net debt position, or liquidity saved, with respect to FIFO. What matters isn't so much of the magnitude of these bars, but the direction. A negative optimization is something that is detrimental to our system. So we can see at lower batch sizes, we had optimal solutions. Each additional payment changes the ground state. So yeah, again, they're not comparable. But when we reached a queue size of 250, we started seeing degraded solutions, and in some cases no solutions at all, until we increased the solve time to counter this. We increased it with respect to a multiplication of the default time, which is calculated with respect to biases of the QBO. We were able to get a solution for the maximum problem size of 700, but that required a solve time of 6 times the default, or about 3 hours, which is quite respectable. We were one of the first, we were told, to use the CQM, and upon the new additions to this platform presented by Alan and others, we reran this data, and we can see a significant improvement in these larger batch sizes, that the optimality increases, and we can get better solutions. As mentioned, we use the number of feasible solutions returned from the system as a measure of the optimization quality and the problem difficulty. As the batch size increases, the number of feasible solutions understandably decreases until we counter with an increase in solve time. Upon the new system, we see a dramatic increase in the amount of feasible solutions returned. And thus the quality of the solution also increasing. So to run in real time, we need to do four things. We need to collect our batch submitted by the banks in real time. We then need to compile the CQM object with respect to the number of variables and the constraints as defined by the equation presented by Chris. We then need to send, solve, and receive the answer from D-Wave's system, and then post-process it. The first step increases linearly with batch size, and the second and third step increases quadratically with batch size. We found ourselves constrained between collecting the batch size and increasing time to solve the batch size. This defined our problem at 140, a batch size of 140. This isn't the 700 that we were hoping for, but is a remarkable result, since D-Wave was able to solve this problem in 16 seconds, where a classical solver running mathematical programming on a fairly beefy AWS instance was over 2 hours in many cases, and many cases could not return a solution in a reasonable amount of time. Despite this is a remarkable result when considering the amount of the size of the solution space. So with these constraints understood, we derived an algorithm to a tumbling window, fixed window algorithm to run through different days and calculate the average savings that we could present to the bank. Here, when the quantum optimizer was able to provide a more optimal solution than FIFO, we see a deviation from FIFO, which is the solid blue curve up here. For a batch size of 70, we see a savings of about 33 million, and for 140, we see a savings of 393 million. Upon analysis of these results, we saw when we submitted more dense and interconnected queues of payments, we see a significant increase. So we devised a pre-processing algorithm to submit more dense and interconnected network of payments such that D-Wave is doing the heavy lifting and we're making it simpler. With this change, we see an increase of 450 million for a batch size of 70 and 950 million for a batch size of 140. Running through our data, averaged out, we see an average daily liquidity of about 500 million with a respectable maximum of 1.5 billion. With that, I would like to pass it back over to our fearless founder, Thomas, for conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. So what have we achieved in the project? Number one, very, very important. Based on the old data that is actually provided by the Bank of Canada to us, where the daily volume is actually much lower than the current state. Instead of $500 billion, the old data has roughly around 200 billion on the daily basis, where the model and the algorithm was able to prove that we can actually reduce the liquidity cost by, on the average basis, over $500 million on the daily basis, and very often we can actually achieve over $1 billion. And at the same time, without any significant increase on the settlement risk because of delay. And more importantly, thanks to the D-Wave CQM that able to process in a micro-batching approach 140 payment requests in under 16 seconds, allow us to be able to deploy the potential in a real-time production setting. And at the same time, the Bank of Canada doesn't have to wait for the next 5 to 10 years. They can do it now. So what we're going to do next, obviously, as I mentioned before, I would love to be able to actually solve the $2 trillion problem. We would like to be the first one in the world to be able to run the quantum optimizer for high-value payment processing for all the central banks in production in the world. And at the same time, we would like to continuously improving the quantum algorithm, as Alan suggested before yesterday, with the subscription model is actually getting into the developer model instead of a utilization charging model. We're now able to actually release ourselves from using a tumbling window to a sliding window, which is inspired by the classical. And at the same time, our classical team will continue to provide the inspiration on their side, which today I didn't bring them here because I know they will absolutely try to sabotage the D-Wave party. Nothing is going to happen under my watch. And at the same time, we would like to be able to actually provide the similar strategy for the single bank purpose. Thank you very much for, again, for D-Wave to allow us to present our solution. And very special thanks to the team at D-Wave, particularly Alexandra Koskovi, that really help us on refining the solutions because we are probably the first one who is using the CQM model. So thank you very much.